Witness this. November 333 BCE, the town of Issus, northern Syria. Macedonian scouts entered what should have been their safe rear position and found the wounded they'd left behind 3 days earlier. The men were alive. Barely. The Persians had gone through the makeshift hospitals methodically, house by house, patient by patient. They cut off hands. Both hands, at the wrist, cauterized so the men wouldn't bleed out too quickly. Some had their eyes taken. The scouts found them propped against walls, stumps wrapped in Persian medical linen, left alive specifically so they could be found, so they could tell the story. One man managed to speak. He said the Persian soldiers worked in teams, efficient, professional, not torture, a process. When they finished with the wounded, they moved to the support staff, cooks, grooms, supply clerks. Same treatment, hundreds of men, the ones who were too sick to move, too injured to survive the procedure, those they killed outright. Mercy compared to the alternative. The scouts counted roughly 300 mutilated survivors. They stopped counting the dead. When the reports reached Alexander's column, marching south along the coastal road towards Syria, the men went quiet. Not angry yet. Quiet. There's a specific silence that happens in an army when soldiers understand that surrender isn't on the table anymore, when the rules they thought governed war suddenly don't apply. The Persians wanted them to know what capture meant. They wanted Alexander's army to feel the empire's reach, to understand that this wasn't a war between kings, but a statement about what happens to invaders. This wasn't brutality. This was communication. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand why this mutilation guaranteed a bloodbath, you have to understand the trap Alexander just walked into. That same morning, November 333, Alexander's army was strung out along the narrow coastal plain south of Issus, marching in column formation toward what they thought would be the next battle. 40,000 men stretched across 8 to 10 miles of road, mountains pressing in from the left, the Mediterranean on their right. The army moved in sections: advance cavalry, infantry blocks, baggage train, rear guard, standard march formation, vulnerable formation. Then scouts came galloping back from the north, horses lathered, faces carrying that specific expression that tells a commander the world just changed. They had news that made no tactical sense. Darius was behind them, not ahead, where every map and every spy report said he should be. Behind. The Persian king had crossed the Amanus Mountains through the Balan Pass with his entire army while Alexander was moving south, and now sat blocking the road back to Macedonia. Alexander's supply line, his line of retreat, his connection to home, all of it cut. The scouts estimated Darius brought between 80,000 and 120,000 men. Ancient sources would later claim 600,000, which was propaganda. But even the conservative modern estimates meant Alexander was outnumbered 2 to 1, maybe worse, and he was on the wrong side of the enemy. You've been told this was Alexander's brilliant tactical victory, but watch what actually happened. A 25-year-old just got outmaneuvered strategically. Darius picked the battlefield. Darius chose the timing. Darius held the numerical advantage. What Alexander did next wasn't genius. It was desperation executed with absolute conviction. Alexander received the scout reports while riding in the center of his column. Officers gathered. Maps came out, scratched in the dirt with sticks. Someone asked the obvious question: how did they miss an army that size moving through the mountains? The answer didn't matter. Darius was north. Alexander was south. The coastal plain here, at this specific point, ran maybe 3 miles wide between the mountains and the sea. 3 miles. Enough room for maybe 50,000 men to fight effectively in formation. Anything more, and they'd be packed so tight the rear ranks couldn't engage. Alexander looked at his officers and did the math out loud. He counted the width of the plain, the depth of a proper phalanx formation. How many men could actually bring weapons to bear in a space that narrow? The numbers worked, barely. Then he looked north, back the way they came, and made the call. "He's cut us off from Macedonia," Alexander said. The sources don't record his exact words, but they record what happened next, which tells you what he meant. Good. Now he can't run. He meant it. That's what made him different. The army turned around, full reversal. 40,000 men executing a about-face on a narrow coastal road, reforming from march column into battle order while moving north. They marched through the afternoon, through the night, 30 miles back to Issus. The men who'd just heard about their mutilated brothers, who knew what waited if they lost, who understood that Darius brought 2 or 3 soldiers for every one of theirs. No major desertions, no units breaking. They marched toward the enemy that had cut off their escape, and they did it in darkness, exhausted, carrying 50 pounds of equipment each. An army that can march all night toward an enemy twice its size isn't brave. It's past the point where courage matters. They're running on something else. Rage, calculation, the metabolic high that comes from having no choice but forward. But here's the real problem. The equation Alexander was solving as his army marched north through the darkness. How do you fight when you're outnumbered 2-1? The standard answer is, you don't. You avoid battle, you harass supply lines, you wait for the enemy to make a mistake. Alexander didn't have that option. Darius was blocking his supplies. The Macedonian army could maybe last a week, 2 if they stripped the countryside. Darius, sitting in his own territory, with the full resources of the Persian Empire behind him, could wait forever. So Alexander had to attack, had to turn around his exhausted army and march them into a force double or triple their size, had to win. The alternative was watching his army starve, fragment, or surrender piece by piece. The math gets worse. Persian cavalry, 30 to 40,000 mounted soldiers, the best in the world, drawn from every corner of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. Alexander's cavalry, his companions and Thessalians, maybe 5,000 total. In open terrain, on the plains where Darius wanted this fight, those numbers meant annihilation. Cavalry fights are about momentum and mass. You don't outfight a force 8 times your size. You die in formation, professionally, and military historians write respectful things about your discipline. But the coastal plain at Issus, where the Pinarus River cut through the valley, that narrowed to maybe 2.5 kilometers between the mountains and the sea. In that space, most of those Persian cavalry couldn't deploy effectively. They'd be packed in, shoulder to shoulder, unable to maneuver. Darius's advantage would turn into a logistics problem. His rear ranks would just be standing there, watching, waiting for room to engage. Alexander saw it. Darius apparently didn't, or he saw it and thought the terrain would protect his flanks, which was true, or that his infantry in the center could hold while his cavalry crushed Alexander's wings, which was logical. But logic assumes both sides are playing the same game. Darius was fighting to win a battle. Alexander was fighting to kill a king. As his army approached Issus through the pre-dawn darkness, Alexander rode along the column, not at the front with his usual position, but moving up and down the line, letting soldiers see him awake, working, sharing the exhaustion. This was calculated leadership. Soldiers don't follow commanders who ask them to do things the commander won't do himself. They follow men who suffer visibly with them, who make the shared misery feel like a pact instead of an order. Alexander understood this instinctively, or his father Philip had beaten it into him during training. Either way, he spent that night march making sure every section of his army saw him not sleeping, not resting, carrying the same weight they carried. By dawn, they reached the Pinarus River Valley. Scouts returned with the layout. Darius had deployed. The entire Persian army sat on the north bank of the river, formed up, waiting. Alexander called his officers together one more time. Maps in the dirt again. Parmenion, his second in command, 60-something years old, Philip's generation, looked at the Persian position and ran the numbers. "They're too deep in the center," Parmenion said, pointing at where the Greek mercenaries, Darius's elite infantry, 15,000 professional soldiers, held the line. "They don't have room for their cavalry." Alexander looked at the map, at the narrow plain, at where the Persian flanks bunched up against mountains and sea. "They will," he said, "once we hit them." He was right. But first he had to get there before Darius realized the trap was actually his own. But to understand why Alexander bet everything on this single battle, why Darius thought showing up in person would end the war, why 40,000 Macedonians were about to charge 80,000 Persians in a space so narrow you could walk across it in 30 minutes, you need to see what brought these two men to this strip of land. Because this wasn't about tactics. This was about two empires with definitions of power that couldn't coexist. One of them built on tribute and fear, held together by the idea that the Persian king was unbeatable. The other built on a weapons system so mechanically superior it didn't care about odds, and they were about to collide in a space where numbers stopped meaning what everyone thought they meant. The story you know says this was Greece versus Persia, West versus East, freedom versus tyranny. Forget that. By 333 BCE, that script was 150 years old, and nobody believed it anymore. The Greeks had been fighting for Persia as mercenaries for generations. Persian gold funded half the wars in Greece. Athens took Persian bribes. Sparta took Persian bribes. Thebes allied with Persia against other Greeks. This wasn't civilization versus barbarians. This was a family business, the Macedonian royal house, attempting a hostile takeover of a 200-year-old imperial system that employed more Greeks than Greece did. The question wasn't philosophy. The question was whether a kingdom of maybe 3 million people could successfully invade a state controlling 50 million, roughly 20 to 30% of everyone alive. The Persian Empire in 333 BCE ran from the Aegean coast to the Indus River, from the Caucasus Mountains to the deserts of Sudan, 1,500 miles east to west if you walked the Royal Road. That road, stone-paved, way stations every 15 miles, courier system that could move a message from Sardis to Susa in 7 days, was the physical proof that this empire wasn't some loose collection of conquered tribes. This was infrastructure. When Darius wanted to move an army, he didn't hope supplies would appear. He sent orders down the royal road, and 20 satraps, provincial governors, mobilized their regions like pulling a lever. Each satrap controlled a territory the size of a major Greek state, commanded local armies, collected tribute, and sent it up the chain. The annual take ran around 14,500 talents of silver. To put that in scale, you can see 1 talent could pay a warship crew for a month. Darius collected enough tribute to run 450 warships year-round, and he wasn't running a navy that size because most of that silver went to administration, garrisons, palace construction, and the standing army. That army was the empire's other proof. not a militia you called up when you needed it. A permanent force stationed across the empire, drawing pay, equipped from imperial arsenals, trained in rotations. The core, 10,000 immortals, the royal guard, stayed with the king. Satraps commanded regional levies. When Darius mobilized for Issus, he pulled from Bactria, from Media, from Cappadocia, from Egypt, cavalry from the Iranian plateau where boys learned to ride before they could write, infantry from Anatolia, from Phoenicia, from Babylon, Greek mercenaries, 15,000 professionals at Issus who fought for Persia because Persia paid in silver, on time, and didn't care which Greek city-state you'd betrayed to get there. This wasn't an army. This was a staffing solution for imperial security. Alexander saw this system from the inside before he ever invaded it. His father, Philip, sent embassies to Persia. Persian ambassadors came to Pella, the Macedonian capital, bringing gifts that made Macedonian nobles feel provincial. Gold worked into patterns Macedonian craftsmen couldn't replicate. Silk from territories so far east, the Greeks thought they were mythical. Spices that cost more per pound than Macedonian silver. The message under the gifts was clear. You're a border kingdom. We're the world. One Persian ambassador reportedly told Philip that his entire kingdom's annual revenue wouldn't pay for a single month of the Persian king's household expenses. Probably an exaggeration. Probably not much of one. Young Alexander, maybe 14 when that embassy visited, watched his father accept the gifts with polite words and calculating eyes. Philip understood scale. He'd spent years as a hostage in Thebes, learning from Greek generals, watching how infantry tactics could compensate for being outnumbered. He came home and built Macedonia into a military state. Professional army, standardized equipment, relentless drilling, a tax system designed to fund permanent mobilization. But Philip knew the math. Even with his reforms, Macedonia couldn't match Persian resources in a straight fight. What Philip built wasn't designed to conquer Persia. It was designed to hurt Persia badly enough that they'd pay him to stop. That was the game. Raid, win a few battles, negotiate a massive bribe, go home rich. Alexander inherited that army at 20 when Philip was assassinated. Within 2 years, he crossed into Asia with 43,000 men and a treasury that could fund maybe 6 months of campaigning. He won the first battle at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, 11,000 Persians dead, 2,000 Greek mercenaries captured and sent to Macedonia in chains as traitors. But Granicus was a border skirmish, local satraps and regional forces. Darius wasn't there. The empire barely noticed. Darius III noticed by the time Alexander spent a year securing the Anatolian coast, taking city after city, cutting off Persian naval bases. The Mediterranean mattered. Persia's fleet was 300 ships, mostly Phoenician and Greek crews, based in ports along the Levantine coast. As long as Persia controlled those ports, they could land armies behind Alexander, cut his supply lines, support rebellions in Greece. Alexander's strategy wasn't subtle. Take every port, deny the fleet its bases, turn the naval war into a land war. It worked slowly, expensively, and it backed Darius into a decision he'd been avoiding. Here's where you kill the cartoon. Darius III wasn't a coward or an idiot. He was a survivor in a system that murdered failed kings. He became king in 336 BCE, same year as Alexander, after the previous king, and most of the royal family got poisoned in a palace purge orchestrated by a vizier named Bagoas. Darius was a distant cousin, not in the direct line, and sources say he earned his position by killing a Caducean champion in single combat during a campaign. He was in his 40s by Issus, an experienced commander, and he understood what Alexander was doing along the coast. The longer Darius waited, the weaker the Persian naval position became. He had to fight. The question was when and where. His advisors split. The Greek mercenary commanders, men like Charidemus and Amyntas, who'd been fighting for Persia for years, told him to avoid pitched battle. Use the space. Let Alexander stretch his supply lines, raid from the flanks, wait for winter. The Persians could afford to wait. Alexander couldn't. That was the smart play. But Darius had a problem those mercenaries didn't fully appreciate. He wasn't just fighting a military campaign. He was managing an empire where every satrap was doing political math, calculating whether their future involved staying loyal to a king who kept retreating or switching sides to the Macedonian who kept winning. 200 years of Persian imperial authority rested on a simple equation. The king shows up, the king wins, the empire stays together. Break that equation, and satraps start negotiating private deals. So Darius came in person. He mobilized the full imperial levy, 80 to 120,000 men, maybe more. Sources conflict. He brought the royal guard, the immortals, his personal cavalry, the Greek mercenaries, regional levies from 20 satrapies, supply trains stretching for miles. He brought his family, mother, wife, children, to show confidence. He brought his royal tent, his chariot, his regalia. Everything about the deployment said, "This ends now." He crossed the Amanus Mountains through the Belan Pass in early November 333, deliberately cutting Alexander's line of retreat, forcing the battle. In the open plains, he becomes his father. Darius reportedly told his council when they debated the position at Issus. In the narrows, he's just another Greek. He was right about what the terrain would do. He was wrong about what Alexander would become when he had no choice. Think of Darius's logic like a product launch. He had market dominance, brand recognition, superior resources. The competitor was gaining ground by undercutting him in specific markets, those coastal cities. His executive team advised patience, long-term strategy. But the board, those satraps, was getting nervous, stock price dropping, shareholders asking questions. Sometimes you have to make a big move to prove you're still in control, even if the tactical situation isn't perfect. Darius made that move. He chose Issus deliberately, the narrows, the restricted terrain. He thought it protected his flanks and negated Alexander's cavalry quality with pure mass. He wasn't stupid. He was thinking about a different problem than Alexander was solving. Now, pull back to what Philip built, because this is where the actual advantage lived, not in genius or bravery, but in engineering, the Macedonian Phalanx. Every man carrying a sarissa, a pike 18 to 20 feet long, cornel wood, iron tip, heavy enough that it took both hands to wield, your shield, smaller than a Greek hoplites because you couldn't hold a full shield, and the sarissa strapped to your left forearm. You fought in formation 16 men deep. The front 5 ranks held sarissas forward, creating a hedge of iron points projecting 10 to 15 feet ahead of your formation. The rear ranks held their sarissas vertical, ready to lower when the front ranks fell. This wasn't a weapon. This was a physics equation. The front rank of any enemy formation had to cross 15 feet of pike points before they could reach you with their shorter spears. They couldn't. The math said no. They'd hit those points, impale themselves, and die while you kept pushing forward. Philip spent 20 years developing this. Not just the weapon, but the training system to make it work. Phalanx warfare demanded mechanical precision. If your formation broke, if gaps opened, if men panicked and stepped out of line, the sarissa became a liability, too long to use individually, too awkward to defend yourself. So Philip drilled them. 2 to 3 years minimum before a soldier was combat ready. They trained in formation until the movements were metabolic. They learned to march in step, maintain spacing, dress their lines while moving over broken ground. They learned to kill while terrified. That last part was the real innovation. Most armies broke when they got scared. The Phalanx killed when it was terrified, because the formation was stronger than individual fear. Combine that with the companion cavalry, Macedonian aristocrats who'd grown up riding, hunting, training for war as their full-time occupation. They fought with Ziston lances, 10 to 12 feet long, in wedge formations designed to punch through enemy lines. The tactic was called the hammer and anvil. Phalanx was the anvil, slow, heavy, inexorable. Cavalry was the hammer, fast, concentrated, devastating at the point of impact. Fix the enemy with the phalanx. Hit their flank with the cavalry. Watch them collapse. Simple, brutal. It worked as long as you had the discipline to execute it while men were dying around you. Alexander learned this system from the inside. He commanded his first cavalry charge at 18 during Philip's campaign at Cheronea against the combined Greek states. Led the companions through the Theban sacred band, 300 elite infantry, paired lovers who swore to die rather than retreat. They died. Alexander rode over them. That was his introduction to command. Watching men he'd been told were the best fighters in Greece break apart under Macedonian cavalry, realizing that reputation meant nothing against systematic violence. His father died 2 years later, assassinated at a wedding, stabbed by a bodyguard who had a personal grudge, though the conspiracy theory started immediately and never stopped. Alexander was 20. Half his father's officers assumed he was a figurehead, that Parmenion or Antipater, older generals, Philip's generation, would run the kingdom. They were wrong. Alexander's first act was executing everyone connected to the assassination, real or imagined. His second was marching north to crush a Thracian rebellion before they'd finished mourning Philip. His third was burning Thebes to the ground when they revolted, killing or enslaving the entire population except for one house, the descendants of the poet Pindar, because Alexander had read Pindar and liked his work. That last detail told you something about him. He could be sentimental about poetry and genocidal about politics in the same week. By the time he crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, he'd proven he could command. The question was what he'd do with it. Philip's war council had argued for limited objectives: secure the Greek cities on the Anatolian coast, hurt Persia enough that they'd pay tribute, declare victory. Alexander listened to those arguments, nodded politely, and once he crossed the Hellespont, ignored them completely. He marched inland. He took cities that had nothing to do with securing coastal access. He started acting like someone who intended to conquer the entire empire, not negotiate with it. At Granicus, the first Persian response, he'd almost died. Took a sword to his helmet that cracked the bronze, got saved by Clitus the Black, one of his officers, cutting down the Persian noble who dismounted to finish him. That moment should have been a warning. Alexander commanded from the front. He didn't lead from behind lines, sending orders. He rode into contact with the companions, which meant every battle carried the risk that a lucky Persian sword ended the entire invasion. His officers hated it. His men loved it. You can't ask soldiers to march toward people trying to kill them if you're not willing to do it yourself. Alexander understood this instinctively, or he was suicidal, or both. After Granicus, he spent a year on the coast, taking Miletus, Halicarnassus, the Lycian cities. Some surrendered, some resisted. The ones that resisted usually wished they hadn't. Alexander's siege tactics were patient and absolute. He'd build siege works, starve you out, offer terms once. If you refused, he'd take the city anyway and crucify your leadership, or sell your population as slaves. This wasn't personal. This was signaling. Every city he took sent a message to the next one: negotiate or die. By the time he reached Syria, most cities were doing math before he arrived, but Darius was doing different math. Every city Alexander took was one more piece of imperial authority eroded. Every month Alexander stayed in the field was proof that Persia couldn't stop him. The empire wasn't built on fortifications. It was built on the idea that resistance was futile because the king commanded infinite resources and inevitable victory. Darius couldn't afford to let that idea die. He mobilized the imperial army, the full weight of the system, everything Philip had spent his life teaching Alexander to fear, and marched west to break the Macedonian upstart before the empire's authority broke first. The two armies moved toward each other through October 333, Alexander marching south along the coast, Darius marching west with his massive force. They missed each other. Alexander kept going south, expecting to meet Darius in the Syrian plains, where the Persian numerical advantage would be overwhelming. Instead, Darius crossed the mountains behind him, chose the narrows at Issus, and waited. When Alexander's scouts brought the news, his officers thought it was a mistake. Parmenion asked for confirmation 3 times. The logic made no sense. Why would Darius choose terrain that negated his own advantage? But the reports kept coming back the same. Darius was north, blocking their retreat, deployed and waiting. Alexander looked at the maps, at the narrowness of the coastal plain at Issus, at the Pinarus River position. He did the math. In that space, maybe 40 to 50,000 men could fight effectively. Any more, and they'd be packed too tight to engage. Darius brought 80,000 or more, which meant 30 to 40,000 Persians would just be standing around, waiting for room that wouldn't come. The terrain Darius chose to protect his flanks would strangle his own army. He built his own cage, Alexander said, though accounts differ on the exact phrasing. What's certain is what happened next. He turned his exhausted army around and marched through the night toward an enemy twice his size in a battle Darius had chosen, on ground Darius had selected. This wasn't genius. This was recognizing that Darius had made a mistake and betting everything that Alexander could exploit it before Darius realized what he'd done. The march took 14 hours, 40,000 men in full kit, moving through darkness, climbing with their equipment up and down the coastal terrain. No major rest stops, no time. If they arrived at dawn, they'd have time to deploy, to organize, to prepare. If they arrived later, Darius might shift position, might recognize the trap he'd built for himself. So they marched. Men fell out from exhaustion, got picked up by their units, kept moving. The wounded from previous battles marched too, because staying behind meant what happened to the last group who stayed behind. Alexander rode the column again. Same technique as before. Be visible. Share the suffering. Let them see you awake, working, refusing rest because they're refusing rest. Command through example, not through orders. By the time they reached the Pinarus River Valley at dawn, soldiers were moving on muscle memory and rage. That combination, exhaustion plus fury plus training, was what Philip had built the army to run on. The sun came up. They saw the Persian position. Darius had deployed during the night, formed his entire army on the north bank of the Pinarus. His line stretched the full width of the plain, roughly 2.5 kilometers from the mountain slopes to the sea. Persian cavalry massed on both flanks, heavy concentration on the right near the coast, Greek mercenaries in the center, deep formation, shields locked. Behind them, Cardaces, Persian infantry, 60,000 or more, packed in so tight they couldn't maneuver, and in the center rear, visible in his ornate chariot, Darius himself. That chariot was a statement. Persian kings fought from chariots in the old style, elevated, visible, commanding. It made you a symbol. It also made you a target. Alexander saw it and smiled. His officers saw him smile and understood. This wasn't about winning the battle. This was about killing the king. The armies spent the morning deploying, Macedonians forming up on the south bank, Phalanx in the center, companions on the right under Alexander, Thessalians on the left under Parmenion, Persians adjusting their lines, cavalry shifting, officers running between units with orders. For 3 hours, men stood in formation in full armor under the November sun, waiting for someone to start the killing. Bladders emptied, prayers whispered, weapons gripped too tight. The metabolic cost of courage. Your body wants to run, but your training keeps you still. By midday, everything was set. 150,000 men arranged in formations designed for killing each other, separated by a river you could jump across. Nobody could leave. Nobody wanted to. The pieces were locked, and both commanders knew that in the next 2 hours, one of them would be dead or running, and everything that came after would trace back to what happened here, at this narrow strip of land where numbers stopped, meaning what they were supposed to mean. Dawn broke over the Pinarus River Valley, and Alexander's scouts reached the southern ridge first. They'd been riding ahead of the main column for the last hour of the march, moving fast through the pre-dawn darkness, and what they saw made them stop. The Persian army was already there, not deploying, not scrambling into position, already formed. Lines stretching the full width of the plain from the mountain foothills on the east to the rocky beach on the west. Cavalry massed on both flanks, infantry blocks in the center so deep you couldn't see their rear ranks. Standards raised, formation set, men standing at rest with weapons grounded. They'd been there for hours, waiting. The scouts rode back to Alexander with the news, and he pushed forward with his officers to see it himself. First light revealing the full scale. Maybe 80,000 men, maybe more, arranged in a line 2.5 kilometers wide. The Persian position sat on slightly higher ground north of the river, which meant Darius had elevation, water as an obstacle, and enough space that his entire army fit the width without bunching. This should have been perfect defensive terrain. Should have been the kind of position where you invite the enemy to exhaust themselves attacking uphill across a river into prepared formations. But Alexander saw something else. He sat on his horse for maybe 5 minutes, not speaking, just watching the Persian line, counting units, measuring distances, doing geometry in his head. His officers stayed quiet. You learned not to interrupt when he got that look, the one that meant he was running calculations against constraints. Finally, he pointed at the Persian right flank, the cavalry mass near the coast. "How many?" he asked. Parmenion, his second in command, had been counting too. 30,000, maybe 40, hard to tell with the depth. Alexander nodded, then pointed at the Persian left, where lighter cavalry and infantry held the foothills. Maybe 10,000 there, which means everything else is in the center, Parmenion finished. 60,000 or more. The Greek mercenaries in front, Cardassi's packed behind them. In a space 2.5 kilometers wide. They're deep, 20, 30 men deep in places. Alexander looked at his second in command. Parmenion was in his 60s, Philip's generation, a competent general who thought in traditional terms about how battles worked. "What happens to the rear ranks?" Alexander asked. Parmenion understood immediately. "They watch, they wait, they're too far back to engage." So Darius brought 80,000 men to a battlefield where maybe 40,000 can actually fight. He's protecting his flanks, mountains and sea. We can't get around him. No, Alexander said. We can't get around him, but we can go through him. Here's what he understood that Darius apparently didn't. Depth in a formation matters for two reasons. First, it gives you reserves. When your front ranks collapse, rear ranks step forward. Second, it gives you mass. The weight of men pushing from behind drives the front rank forward. Both effects work up to a point. Beyond that point, you're just stacking men who can't participate. The Persian center was beyond that point. The Cardaces in the rear, those 60,000 Persian infantry packed behind the Greek mercenaries, couldn't engage until the formations in front of them broke or moved. They were spectators with weapons, waiting for space that wouldn't come until the battle was already decided. The Macedonian Phalanx, 16 men deep with 18-foot pikes, was designed to exploit exactly this problem. You didn't need to defeat all 60,000 Persian infantry. You needed to break through the Greek mercenaries in front, 15,000 professionals, and suddenly you were in the Persian rear, among soldiers who'd never expected contact, who were packed too tight to form defensive lines. Alexander saw this. He saw the victory condition. Kill or break the Greek mercenaries, punch through to Darius, make the king run, watch his army collapse when the man they came to see win turned and fled. Simple, except for the part where he had to cross the river under fire, maintain phalanx cohesion while climbing muddy banks, and hit professional Greek infantry head-on with his center, while his flanks dealt with overwhelming Persian cavalry. The plan required everything to go right simultaneously, which meant it probably wouldn't. But he didn't have a choice. Darius was blocking his supplies. The Macedonian army could last maybe a week before they started eating their pack animals. Attack now or starve later. Those were the options. So Alexander chose now, chose violence, chose to turn this into a race where whoever killed the enemy commander first won everything. The Macedonian column began deploying as the sun rose higher. This took hours. You don't arrange 40,000 men into combat formations quickly. Each unit had its position, its spacing requirements, its specific role. The phalanx formed in the center, 6 battalions of roughly 2,000 men each, standing 16 deep in files that ran from the front rank back. Each battalion had its own commander, its own standards, its own identity built over years of training and fighting together. They knew their positions by muscle memory. They moved into formation without orders, dressing their lines automatically, checking spacing with their peripheral vision, making sure the sarissas had clearance. The hypaspists, elite infantry, 3,000 of them, took position on the right side of the phalanx, the place of honor, the hinge between the phalanx and Alexander's cavalry. These men were Alexander's personal guard infantry, selected for skill and loyalty, equipped with shorter spears and larger shields than the phalanx, trained to operate in looser formations when necessary. They could fight like phalanx soldiers when the line was stable, and like skirmishers when it broke. That flexibility mattered. The hypaspists would have to maintain contact between the slow-moving phalanx and the fast cavalry charge Alexander was planning. If that hinge broke, if a gap opened between the two forces, Persian cavalry would pour through and kill everyone from behind. The man commanding the hypaspists was Nicanor, Parmenion's son, in his 30s, competent in the way that generals' sons had to be competent to prove they weren't just riding their father's reputation. He positioned his men carefully, talking to his officers, making sure everyone understood that their job was connection, not glory. Hold the hinge, Nothing else mattered. On the right wing, Alexander assembled his strike force. The companion cavalry, 1,800 Macedonian aristocrats on horses bred for size and aggression, trained since childhood to fight in wedge formations. They'd charge in a triangular shape with Alexander at the point, concentration of mass at a single location, designed to punch through enemy lines rather than sweep along them. Each man carried a Ziston lance, 10 to 12 feet of cornel wood with an iron tip, heavy enough to punch through shields and into the body behind them. These weren't scouts or skirmishers. These were shock troops, the hammer in Philip's hammer and anvil system. Next to the companions, Alexander positioned his prodromoi scouts and Paeonian light cavalry, maybe 1,000 total, fast riders on small horses equipped for harassment and pursuit. They'd screen the companions' advance, deal with Persian skirmishers, and chase down routing enemies once the line broke. Supporting them were the Agrianians, light infantry from Thrace, maybe 1,000 javelin throwers who could move fast over broken ground, keep up with cavalry, and kill from range. Alexander walked among these units as they formed, talking to men he knew by name, checking equipment, asking about their horses. This wasn't inspirational speech-making. This was practical leadership. He asked one companion if his horse had been lame the previous week. Asked another about his brother who'd been wounded at Granicus. Small details that told soldiers their commander remembered them as individuals, not just as components in a tactical formation. It worked because Alexander had a freakish memory for faces and names, and because he'd been training with these men since childhood. They were his age, give or take a few years. They'd grown up together, hunted together, gotten drunk together. Half of them were probably sleeping with each other, given Macedonian aristocratic social customs. When Alexander led them into battle, it wasn't an officer commanding troops. It was one of the pack leading the others toward violence they'd all agreed to commit together. The left wing was Parmenian's problem. The Thessalian cavalry, 1,800 riders, the best heavy cavalry in Greece outside Macedonia, took the primary position. Next to them, Greek allied cavalry, maybe 2,000 men from various city-states who joined Alexander's expedition either willingly or because they didn't have a choice. Behind them, supporting units, Thracian infantry, Cretan archers, reserves. Parmenian's wing was defensive. His job wasn't to win his sector. His job was to not lose it long enough for Alexander to kill Darius. That math, holding against overwhelming numbers while outnumbered 5-1 or worse, was what generals in their 60s got assigned when the 25-year-old king wanted to take the glory position himself. Parmenion accepted this without complaint, which told you something about him. He'd served Philip for decades. He'd been instrumental in building Macedonian power. Now he was babysitting Alexander's flank while the kid charged off to kill the Persian king. But Parmenion was professional. He positioned his cavalry in depth, multiple lines, designed to absorb charges and maintain cohesion. He knew the Persian cavalry on his front would try to crush him through mass, wheel around the Macedonian left, and hit the Phalanx from behind. His job was to die slowly enough that Alexander won first. By mid-morning, both armies were deployed. The Macedonians on the south bank of the Pinarus, arrayed in their standard battle formation, Phalanx center, cavalry wings, light troops supporting. The Persians on the north bank, massive line stretching across the plain, waiting. Between them, the river, maybe 15 feet wide in most places, shallow, but the banks were the problem. 3 to 6 feet of muddy slope in places, steep enough that men in armor would struggle to climb it while maintaining formation. The Persians had stationed archers along the north bank specifically to shoot at anyone crossing. The tactical solution was simple: cross fast, accept casualties, get up the bank, before the formation shattered completely. But there was a timing problem. If Alexander's right wing, the companions and hypaspists, crossed too early, they'd be isolated on the north bank without support, vulnerable to the Persian cavalry on that flank. If they crossed too late, the Phalanx in the center would get butchered trying to climb the banks without flank protection. Everything had to move together, which meant Alexander needed to control the timing of the entire battle, dictate when the engagement started, and do it in a way that forced the Persians to respond to his geometry rather than their numerical advantage. He decided to provoke them. Instead of advancing straight across, he began moving his right wing obliquely toward the foothills on the east, angling toward the Persian left flank. This forced the Persian cavalry on that flank to shift position to maintain contact, which opened gaps in the Persian line. Small gaps, maybe 200 to 400 meters, but visible from Alexander's elevated position. Those gaps were the target. Not the place where Persian strength was greatest, but the seams where their formations had to adjust, where coordination became uncertain, where the difference between a professional army and a multilingual coalition became tactically relevant. As Alexander's wing moved obliquely, you could see the Persian line rippling, units adjusting, cavalry repositioning. Darius could see it happening from his chariot in the center rear. He had perfect visibility, elevated position, clear sight lines across the battlefield. But visibility didn't solve the command problem. To adjust his line, he needed to send orders. Orders took time. Runners had to physically carry messages from the royal position to the wing commanders, who then had to relay them to unit commanders, who then had to execute while maintaining formation. In that lag time, maybe 5 to 10 minutes from decision to execution, Alexander kept moving, kept adjusting, kept forcing the Persians to react to positions that were already changing by the time their response arrived. This was the real advantage of the Macedonian system, not individual soldier quality or tactical brilliance, but systematic advantage. Alexander commanded 40,000 men who spoke one language, trained under one system, responded to standardized orders, and trusted their formation discipline. Darius commanded 80,000 men from 20 provinces who spoke different languages, fought under different tactical traditions, and had varying levels of loyalty to the Persian crown versus their own regional interests. The Greek mercenaries in his center were professionals who'd fight hard because they were being paid and because surrender meant slavery or execution. The Cardaces, those 60,000 Persian infantry, were levies and regional troops whose combat effectiveness varied wildly. The cavalry were elite units from across the empire, excellent fighters, but used to operating independently under satraps, not in coordinated maneuvers directed by a central command. Darius's challenge wasn't tactics, it was coordination. And Alexander was systematically making coordination impossible by forcing constant adjustments. By midday, both armies had been standing in formation for 3 hours. This is the part that doesn't make it into most histories. The metabolic cost: men in full armor, 40 to 50 pounds of equipment, standing in formation under the Mediterranean sun in November. Water discipline became critical. Drink too much and you'd need to piss, which meant breaking formation. Drink too little and you'd collapse from heat exhaustion when the fighting started. Soldiers learned to sip, just enough to keep functioning. Some urinated where they stood. Others held it, bladders painfully full, waiting for permission to break ranks that wouldn't come until the battle started or ended. Fear worked on bodies in specific ways. Some men vomited from anxiety. Others got diarrhea, bowels loosening as their sympathetic nervous system prepared for violence. The smell of 40,000 nervous soldiers in close formation wasn't romantic. It was sweat, urine, vomit, leather, bronze, oil from weapons maintenance, and underneath it all, the particular smell that humans generate when they're about to try to kill each other. Officers walked the lines, maintaining discipline, checking equipment, offering water from skins, saying things that probably didn't help but needed to be said anyway. Stay together, trust your training, watch the man next to you, don't break ranks. The Phalanx works if we work together. Standard pre-battle material, words that soldiers had heard before every fight, words that worked not because they were inspiring, but because they were familiar, ritualistic, part of the process that turned terrified individuals into a formation that could kill. Alexander rode along his lines one final time, not giving a speech. That would come later, if at all. Just being visible, letting the men see him in his armor, on Bucephalus, his horse, positioned at the point of the companion wedge where he'd take the first impact. Command by example. You can't ask men to march toward people trying to kill them if you're not willing to do it yourself, and you especially can't ask it if you're doing it from the back while they die in front. He stopped at the hypaspist's position and found Nicanor. "When we go," Alexander said, "the hinge holds. I don't care what happens on the flanks. The hinge holds." "The hinge holds," Nicanor repeated. This was the critical point. If the hypaspists couldn't maintain contact between the charging cavalry and the slower phalanx, a gap would open and Persian cavalry would exploit it. Everything depended on 3,000 men keeping pace with a cavalry charge while fighting professional infantry. Impossible task. Do it anyway. Alexander moved to the phalanx commanders. He knew all 6 of them personally. They'd trained under Philip, survived the consolidation battles after Philip's death, fought at Granicus. These men didn't need tactical instruction. They needed to know the sequence. "We're going oblique," Alexander told them. "Right wing advances first. You follow when you see us cross. Close the distance fast. Don't let the archers break you on the banks. Once you're across, it's push. That's all. Just push." The phalanx commanders nodded. They understood. This wasn't going to be a technical battle where maneuver and finesse decided outcomes. This was going to be pressure. 16 men deep with 18-foot pikes against 15,000 Greek mercenaries backed by 60,000 Persian infantry in a space so narrow the numbers stopped meaning what they should. Whoever could sustain pressure longest won. Whoever broke first died. Finally, Alexander rode to the left wing, to Parmenion's position. The old general was standing with his cavalry commanders, looking across the river at the massive Persian cavalry force on their front. "They're going to try to crush us," Parmenion said without preamble. "Probably wheel around and hit the phalanx from behind." "I know," Alexander said. "I can hold for a while, can't hold forever." "You don't need forever. You need 2 hours." Parmenion looked at the kid he'd watched grow up, the king who'd inherited Philip's army, and apparently decided to use it in ways Philip never imagined. 2 hours against 5-to-1 odds. "That's why you get the hard job," Alexander said. Then more quietly, "If you run, I die. You know that." "I know," Parmenion said. "We won't run." This was the calculation. The entire battle plan rested on Parmenion's wing not collapsing while Alexander drove for Darius. If the left broke, Persian cavalry would sweep behind the Macedonian line and annihilate everyone from the rear, even if Alexander reached Darius. But if Parmenion held, just held without winning, long enough for Alexander to kill or break the Persian king, then the rest of the Persian army would panic and the math would reverse. It wasn't tactics. It was a race with body count as the clock. By early afternoon, the pieces were locked. 40,000 Macedonians on the south bank, 80,000 Persians on the north bank, separated by a river you could wade across in 30 seconds. The deployment was complete. The plan was set. The trap was built. Both armies understood that in the next few minutes, someone would move first, and everything that followed would be collision, violence, and aftermath. Alexander sat on Bucephalus at the point of the companion wedge, surrounded by his household cavalry, the men who'd grown up with him, who'd followed him across the Hellespont and through Anatolia and to this narrow river valley where they were about to charge an army twice their size. He was looking at the Persian line, at the gaps his oblique movement had created, at Darius's chariot visible in the center rear, and he was doing final calculations: distance to the gap, time to cross, angle of approach. Whether the companions could reach Darius before the Persian guard closed ranks. His hands were steady on the reins. His breathing was controlled, but his heart was hammering, and he knew it, could feel the adrenaline surge that came before violence, the body's preparation for trauma. This was the moment. Everything his father built, everything Alexander had trained for, everything Macedonia had spent 20 years preparing, it all came down to the next 2 hours. Win and the campaign continued. Lose and the entire army died here, bones scattered in a foreign river valley, names forgotten except as a cautionary tale about overreach. He looked back along his line one last time. The companions ready. The hypaspists formed, the Phalanx standing with Sarissa's vertical. Parmenian's wing braced for impact. 40,000 men who'd marched through the night to get here, who'd trusted him this far, who were about to trust him through whatever came next. Alexander raised his arm. The signal. Officers saw it, relayed it. Formations tensed. Across the river, Persian officers saw the movement and shouted warnings. Archers knocked arrows. Cavalry gripped reins tighter. Infantry locked shields. The arm dropped. The companions moved forward from walk to trot, building speed toward the river. The hypaspists advanced with them, maintaining contact. The Phalanx began its advance, slower, maintaining formation, sarissas tilting down from vertical to horizontal as they approached the banks. Both armies began colliding toward each other through the narrow space where numbers didn't matter anymore, where only pressure and will and systematic violence would decide who was still standing when the sun went down. The companions moved forward at a trot, 1,800 cavalry in wedge formation with Alexander at the point. The sound was hooves on packed earth, equipment rattling, leather creaking, horses breathing hard. Behind them, the hypaspists advanced on foot, jogging to keep pace, shields up, shorter spears held ready. Further left, the Phalanx began its slower advance, 6 battalions moving as one mass, sarissas tilting forward into attack position, the forest of iron points catching sunlight as 16,000 men marched toward the river in formation, so tight you could barely see daylight between files. The Persians saw it coming. Officers shouted. Archers along the north bank drew and loosed. The first volley went high, arrows arcing up and falling into the Macedonian formation. Men fell. Not many, maybe 20 or 30 in that first wave, but enough to leave gaps in the line that closed immediately as adjacent soldiers stepped sideways to fill the space. The second volley was better aimed, lower trajectory, hitting the front ranks as they approached the river. Arrows punched through shields, through armor, found flesh. More men fell. The formation kept moving. Alexander urged Bucephalus forward, from trot to canter. The companions accelerated with him, wedge formation tightening as they picked up speed. They hit the river at full gallop, spray erupting as horses plunged into the shallow water. The riverbed was mud and stone, uneven. and horses stumbled. One went down completely, rider thrown forward into the water. The horse behind trampled over him. No time to stop. The wedge kept driving forward. Alexander's horse cleared the water and hit the north bank, hooves scrabbling for purchase on the muddy slope. Bucephalus lunged upward, powerful hindquarters driving, and made it to the top. The companions followed, horses climbing, men leaning forward in their saddles to help the animals balance. Persian cavalry on the left flank, maybe 2,000 light cavalry and infantry, moved to intercept. They hit the companions while Alexander's wedge was still half in the river, horses climbing the bank, formation disrupted. This should have been the moment where the charge broke, but the companions were trained for exactly this chaos. They didn't try to maintain perfect formation. They attacked as individuals and pairs, Xyston lances stabbing forward, horses barging into Persian cavalry, using mass and momentum. Alexander was first into contact. His lance took a Persian horseman in the chest, the iron tip punching through bronze armor and into the body cavity behind. The Persian fell backward off his horse. Alexander released the lance, it was stuck in the body, and drew his kopis, the curved, slashing sword Macedonian cavalry carried for close work. The fighting became immediate and brutal, horses screaming, men shouting in Greek and Persian and Scythian, steel hitting bronze, hitting flesh. A Persian cavalryman swung a sword at Alexander's head. Bucephalus turned, trained to respond to knee pressure, and the blow glanced off Alexander's helmet instead of splitting his skull. Alexander's return stroke caught the Persian across the neck, the kopis edge biting through to the spine. Blood sprayed. The Persian's head lolled forward, nearly severed, and he toppled. Behind Alexander, the companions were climbing out of the river, reforming on the north bank, driving into the Persian cavalry that was trying to contain them. The Hypaspists reached the river and started crossing, climbing the banks under arrow fire, shields raised, men falling, but the formation holding. They made it to the north bank and immediately engaged the Persian infantry, Cardaces, regional levies who'd expected to be reserves, not frontline troops. The Hypaspists hit them with organized violence, short spears stabbing over shield rims, pushing forward in tight formation, killing methodically. This was the gap Alexander had created with his oblique advance. The Persian left flank cavalry and infantry pulled out of position to counter his movement, now isolated from the Greek mercenaries in the center. Between them, maybe 300 meters of space where the Persian line had thinned. Alexander saw it, oriented on it, and drove the companions toward it. The wedge reformed instinctively, battered but functional, and they charged into the gap. They hit the exposed flank of the Greek mercenary phalanx at full speed. 1,800 cavalry, lances and swords, smashing into the side of a professional infantry formation that was facing forward, shields locked, expecting frontal assault from the Macedonian phalanx. The Greeks tried to wheel, to turn their formation 90 degrees to meet the threat. But phalanx don't pivot quickly. They're designed for forward pressure, not lateral movement. The companions tore into them before the maneuver completed. Cavalry hitting infantry from the flank is physics, not combat. The horses weighed half a ton each, moving at 35 kilometers per hour. Men in armor weigh maybe 200 pounds. Impact was mass times velocity divided by the bodies that tried to stop it. Greeks went down under hooves. Lance points punched through shields, through bodies, through the men behind the first rank. The formation buckled, shields shattered. The tight spacing that made phalanx strong became a liability. Men packed too close to dodge, too close to run, just close enough to die together. Alexander was in the front of the wedge, always in the front, killing his way forward. His kopis rose and fell. A Greek mercenary thrust a spear at Bucephalus's chest. The horse reared, forelegs coming up, and the spear glanced off its bronze chamfron, the armor covering its face. Alexander brought his sword down on the Greek's helmet, the impact stunning the man, then reversed the stroke and caught him across the collarbone on the backstroke. The Greek fell. Another took his place immediately, stabbing upward at Alexander's thigh. The point caught in the layered linen and bronze of his armor, didn't penetrate, but tore through and left a gash in his leg. Alexander barely noticed. Adrenaline was suppressing pain, narrowing focus to immediate threats, and the immediate threat was the Greek mercenary formation that was beginning to collapse under the cavalry assault, but wasn't broken yet. The Greek mercenaries were professionals. They'd fought for Persia for years, survived dozens of battles, and they understood that their survival depended on formation integrity. Officers shouted orders. The Greeks contracted, forming a tighter defensive square, shields out, spears presenting a hedge of points. This was the correct response. Against cavalry, you form square. You present points in all directions. You make yourself a problem that costs too much to solve. The companions hit the square and recoiled. Horses won't charge into a wall of spears. They'll shy, turn, refuse. The momentum stalled. This was the crisis point for Alexander. He'd broken into the Persian formation, shattered their left flank. But now the Greek mercenaries were containing him, and every second he spent here was a second the Persians could use to adjust, to bring reinforcements, to close the gap. He needed to break through completely, reach Darius, or this charge would become a suicide mission that died in the middle of the Persian army. Meanwhile, in the center, the Macedonian phalanx was crossing the river. This was harder than the cavalry charge, slower, more vulnerable. The phalanx couldn't charge. They advanced at walking pace, maintaining spacing. Sarissas held horizontal, each man watching the man to his right to keep the line straight. They reached the river and started down the southern bank, sarissas tilting up to clear the water. Men stepped into the stream in formation, shields raised, trying to keep contact with adjacent files. The water was knee-deep, the bottom uneven. Men slipped, caught themselves, kept moving. Arrows fell like rain. Persian archers on the north bank, shooting into massed infantry at close range. Couldn't miss. Men fell. The phalanx absorbed the casualties and kept advancing, rear ranks stepping forward to fill gaps. The north bank was the problem. Steep in places, muddy everywhere, covered with Persian skirmishers and archers waiting to shoot anyone climbing up. The front rank reached the bank and started climbing, shields raised, using their sarissas as climbing poles. Persians stabbed down at them. Men fell backward into the water. Others made it to the top and immediately engaged, sarissas thrusting forward, driving Persians back from the bank. Behind them, more phalanx soldiers climbed, the formation gradually establishing itself on the north bank through sheer pressure and acceptable losses. But the phalanx was strung out now, some battalions across, others still climbing. The formation gapped and vulnerable. The Greek mercenaries in the center of the Persian line saw this and attacked. 15,000 professional infantry hitting a disrupted phalanx formation. This is how you kill phalanx soldiers. Catch them in disorder, get inside their pike range, use shorter weapons in close quarters. The Greeks pushed forward, shields locked, stabbing with short swords and spears, driving into the gaps in the Macedonian line. Men died in the river. Macedonian phalanx soldiers climbing the bank, stabbed from above before they could engage. Bodies sliding back into the water, blood turning the Pinarus red in places. Some drowned, trapped under corpses, held down by 50 pounds of armor, while water filled their lungs. Others made it across only to be killed immediately by Greek mercenaries who were better at close quarters fighting than they were. The Phalanx was taking terrible casualties. Estimates later would say 500 dead, maybe 1,000, most of them in this crossing, in these 10 minutes where formation discipline collapsed and individual soldiers had to fight without the protection of their formation. But they kept coming. This was what Philip built them to do: reform under pressure, close gaps while men died, maintain forward momentum, even when the tactical situation was impossible. Officers shouted themselves hoarse. "Close ranks! Close the fucking ranks!" Men who'd lost their position in the formation found new ones, stepped into gaps, locked shields with strangers, and kept pushing forward. The Phalanx began to cohere on the north bank, battalions linking up, the line reforming. And once they had formation integrity, the sarissas made the difference. 18-foot pikes against 8-foot spears. The Greeks had to cross 10 feet of pike points to engage, and they couldn't. The Phalanx started pushing, slow, inexorable, mechanical. The Greeks pushed back. The pressure was enormous. Men in the front ranks crushed between formations, ribs cracking, unable to breathe, dying upright because there was no room to fall. On the Macedonian left, Parmenions' nightmare was beginning. The Persian right flank, 30 to 40,000 cavalry, the elite Hyrcanian and Persian heavy cavalry, hit his Thessalians in a mass assault designed to overwhelm through pure numbers. Imagine 30,000 horsemen charging in waves against 3,000. The math was simple. You didn't outfight that. You died professionally and hoped you bought enough time. The first wave hit. Thessalian cavalry braced. Lances forward, taking the impact. Men and horses collided. The Thessalians killed dozens in that first contact. Their lances, their training, their discipline were superior to most Persian cavalry. But dozens out of 30,000 was a rounding error. The second wave hit before they could recover. Then the third. The Thessalians were being pushed back, formations compressing, losing space. Persian cavalry was beginning to work around their flanks, trying to get behind them, trying to reach the rear of the Macedonian phalanx. Parmenion rode in the thick of it, an old man in armor, killing with the efficiency that came from 40 years of experience. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to slow the collapse. Every minute he held was a minute for Alexander to reach Darius. That was the only objective that mattered. His Thessalians understood. They fought like men who knew they were dead, taking risks that made sense only if survival wasn't the goal. A Thessalian cavalry squadron, maybe 50 men, charged directly into a Persian formation 3 times their size, killed 30 Persians, and died almost to the last man. They bought 2 minutes. That was the exchange rate. Back in the center, Alexander had broken through the Greek mercenary square. The companions, reinforced by the Hypaspists who'd fought their way along the flank, overwhelmed the Greeks through sustained pressure. The square collapsed. Greeks broke and ran, some toward the foothills, others trying to retreat through the Persian infantry behind them. The companions didn't pursue. They wheeled, oriented on Darius's position, and charged deeper into the Persian center. Now they were among the Cardaces, the 60,000 Persian infantry who'd been standing in deep formation, waiting for the battle to reach them. These men weren't prepared for cavalry. They were packed too tight to form defensive positions. They tried anyway, officers screaming orders, men grabbing shields and spears, attempting to present a front. The companions didn't slow down. They hit the disorganized Persians at speed and carved through them. This wasn't combat. This was slaughter. infantry without formation, without space to maneuver, getting trampled and stabbed by cavalry moving at full speed. Alexander could see Darius now. The Persian king's chariot was maybe 200 meters away, surrounded by his royal guard, the immortals, Persian elite infantry, the best soldiers in the empire, maybe 2,000 of them, formed in deep ranks around their king. This was the target. Kill Darius or make him run, and the Persian army would collapse. Alexander drove the companions straight at them. The immortals were professionals. They'd been trained since childhood for this exact scenario, protecting the king under impossible circumstances. They locked shields, formed a wall, and prepared to die. The companions hit them, and the immortals held. Horses couldn't break the shield wall. Lances stabbed over the shields, killing immortals in the front rank, but the rear ranks stepped forward immediately, closing gaps, maintaining the wall. Alexander was in the front of the wedge, trading blows with immortals who were trying to kill him specifically, recognizing his armor, his position, understanding that killing the Macedonian king would end this just as surely as Alexander killing Darius would. An immortal thrust a spear through the press of bodies and caught Alexander in the shoulder, the point sliding between bronze plates and into muscle. Pain shot through his arm. The spear stuck, lodged in armor and flesh. Alexander grabbed the shaft with his free hand, yanked it forward, pulling the immortal off balance, and killed him with a downward sword stroke. The spear came loose. Blood was running down Alexander's arm, soaking his tunic. He ignored it. Bucephalus was bleeding too, multiple wounds, but still fighting, still responding to commands. The companions were dying, not routing, not breaking, but dying in formation, killing immortals at a rate of 3-1, but losing men they couldn't replace. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend, his probable lover, his second in command of the companions, took a sword stroke across his helmet that dented the bronze and dropped him half-conscious in his saddle. Clitus the Black, who'd saved Alexander at Granicus, was fighting 3 immortals simultaneously, bleeding from multiple wounds, still killing. This was unsustainable. They were winning the exchange rate, but losing the math. In 5 more minutes they'd be dead, surrounded by immortal corpses, having accomplished nothing. Then the immortal line wavered. Not broke, just wavered. A gap appeared, maybe 10 feet wide, where too many had died and the rear ranks hadn't filled in fast enough. Alexander saw it. He drove Bucephalus through the gap, the companions following. Wedge formation punching through the immortal wall like a fist through paper. They were through. In the center of the Persian formation, the royal guard was behind them now, and ahead was Darius. 20 meters. Darius was 20 meters away in his ornate chariot, visible in his royal regalia, surrounded by the last ring of guards. The Persian king saw Alexander coming, saw the blood-covered Macedonian on a wounded horse, leading cavalry that looked like they'd been through a slaughterhouse, driving straight at him. Darius's charioteer died, arrow or javelin, the man collapsing across the reins. The horses screamed and reared. The chariot lurched. Darius had a choice. He could stand, fight, die as a king should, defend his position, and hope the immortals could rally and kill Alexander. Or he could live. Live and preserve the empire's command structure. Live and raise another army. Live and continue the war. It wasn't cowardice. It was calculation. The emperor wasn't the empire. The empire needed him alive more than it needed him brave. 10 meters. Alexander was close enough to see Darius's face, see the moment of decision. The Persian king grabbed a horse, someone's cavalry mount, saddled but riderless, and swung up onto it. His guards were dying around him, trying to buy time. Darius turned the horse and spurred it northeast, toward the mountains, toward escape. Alexander saw him run. So did everyone else. You can't hide a king fleeing the battlefield. The royal chariot, empty, horses panicking, Darius on horseback, moving away from the fight. The Persian center saw it and understood. Their god king, the man they'd marched across Asia to follow, was running. Word spread instantly, faster than messengers, a psychological shockwave through the entire Persian army. The Greek mercenaries who'd survived the companion charge and were fighting withdrawal toward the foothills saw it. The Cardaces in the center, still technically in formation but unengaged, saw it. The cavalry on the wings, locked in combat with Parmenion and Alexander's flanks, heard the shouts and looked back and saw the empty chariot. The army didn't break all at once. It broke in sections, starting from the center and rippling outward. First, the Cardaces, rear ranks turning and running because they'd never expected combat anyway, and now the king was gone, so why die for nothing? Then the Greek mercenaries, professionals who understood that staying meant death without pay, running for the mountains in organized retreat. Then the cavalry, disengaging where they could, fleeing where they couldn't. Parmenion's wing was saved by the Persian cavalry suddenly turning and running. One moment they were being crushed under overwhelming numbers. The next, the Persian right wing was disengaging, riders turning their horses, fleeing northeast. The Thessalians, exhausted and bleeding, didn't pursue. They just stopped, holding position, watching the Persians run, trying to understand that they weren't dead. In the center, the Macedonian phalanx pushed forward into Persians who'd stopped fighting. The Greeks stabbed men in the back as they ran. This was the ugly part, the part that doesn't make it into heroic accounts. Soldiers fleeing, throwing down weapons, begging for mercy. Getting killed anyway because the phalanx couldn't stop its momentum, and because after the casualties in the crossing, Macedonian soldiers weren't interested in mercy. The Pinarus River became a killing ground. Persians trying to flee south, back across the river, getting caught at the banks. Men slipping in mud, falling into water, drowning under other bodies. Men being stabbed as they tried to climb down the bank. Men surrendering, being killed anyway. The water turned red for real this time, not just in places but across the entire width. Bodies piling up at the crossing points, creating dams of flesh that diverted the river's flow. Alexander didn't pursue Darius. He wanted to. Every instinct said chase, finish it, kill the Persian king, and end the war now. But he looked around and saw his companions, less than half still mounted and combat effective, saw the immortals regrouping, still dangerous, saw the battle still happening on the flanks, and he made the calculation. Chasing Darius meant taking his battered cavalry into Persian territory, away from the army, risking death or capture for the chance of killing one man. Winning the battle meant consolidating, securing the victory, making sure this didn't turn into a Persian rally. He chose the battle, turned the companions back toward the Persian center, and finished breaking what was left of their formation. The fighting continued for another hour. Not organized battle, just pursuit and slaughter. Macedonians chasing fleeing Persians, cutting them down from behind. Greek mercenaries who'd managed to form defensive squares getting surrounded and butchered. Persian cavalry who'd lost their commanders riding in circles, getting hunted by Macedonian light cavalry. Small acts of violence multiplied across 5 square kilometers of battlefield, adding up to the casualty counts that ancient sources would record with varying accuracy. By late afternoon, it was over. The The Persian army had disintegrated. Bodies covered the battlefield. Macedonian soldiers, exhausted beyond the point where adrenaline could sustain them, collapsed where they stood. Officers walked among them, checking who was alive, who was dead, who was dying. The practical aftermath: stripping armor from corpses, recovering weapons, counting losses, organizing burial details. Alexander dismounted from Bucephalus and immediately collapsed. His shoulder wound, adrenaline crash, exhaustion from the night march and the battle. His officers caught him, lowered him down carefully. A physician appeared. Armies traveled with physicians for exactly this, and examined the wounds. The shoulder was bad, the spear had gone deep, but not fatal if infection didn't set in. The leg wound was superficial. Multiple bruises and contusions, dehydration, exhaustion. Nothing that would kill him if he rested. They carried him to a captured Persian tent and laid him on silk bedding that some Persian noble had brought to the battlefield. He was asleep before they finished bandaging his shoulder. The battlefield after dark was a specific kind of horror. Wounded men screaming in multiple languages. Soldiers wandering looking for friends, for brothers, for their units. Scavengers, camp followers, locals, opportunists, moving among the bodies, taking anything valuable. The Macedonians tried to maintain some order, posted guards, organized the wounded into collection points. But 5,000 dead and wounded Macedonians, 40 to 50,000 dead and wounded Persians, scattered across kilometers of terrain in darkness. You couldn't control that. You just tried to save who you could and accepted that many would die during the night from wounds that might have been treatable in daylight. Parmenion found Nicanor, his son, alive but wounded. Took an arrow through the thigh during the river crossing. He'd kept fighting, kept the hypaspists in formation, held the hinge until the battle ended. Now he was being carried to the physician's tent, fever already starting from infection. Parmenion walked beside him, old hands gripping young hands, not speaking because there was nothing useful to say. The count came in gradually over the next days. Macedonian dead. Sources would claim 450, which was propaganda, almost certainly. Real number probably closer to 800 to 1,000 killed in action. Another 500 to 1,000 who die from wounds. Greek allied casualties, heavier, maybe 1,500 dead. Persian casualties, impossible to count accurately. 40 to 50,000 dead was the estimate, tens of thousands wounded, tens of thousands captured. The Greek mercenaries who'd escaped to the mountains, maybe 8,000 of them, would show up later in the war, still fighting for Persia, still professional, still expensive. The Macedonians found the Persian camp that night. It stretched for miles. Tens of thousands of support personnel. Servants, slaves, craftsmen, cooks, grooms, wealth beyond anything the Macedonians had seen, gold worked into furniture, silk tents, food supplies sufficient for months. And in the royal tent, Darius's family, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, his daughters, his 6-year-old son. They were terrified, expecting rape and execution, the standard treatment for captured royal families. Alexander, wounded and exhausted, dragged himself to the tent. He entered with Hephaestion. The Persian royal family, on their knees, mistook Hephaestion for Alexander. He was taller, more physically imposing. Sisygambis, Darius's mother, prostrated herself before Hephaestion. Someone corrected her. She turned to Alexander, started to apologize. "You're not wrong," Alexander said through a translator. "He is also Alexander." Then he declared they would be treated as royalty, not prisoners. Given royal quarters, royal food, royal respect. This wasn't mercy. This was strategy. Alexander needed the Persians to see him as a legitimate ruler, not a barbarian conqueror. Dead royal families made martyrs. Living ones, treated well, made legitimacy. That night, lying in a captured Persian tent, shoulder throbbing, hearing the screams of wounded men outside, Alexander understood what he'd done. He'd won. Beaten an army twice his size, killed 40,000 men, survived wounds that could easily have killed him, proven he could execute his father's tactics at scale, and he'd done it by gambling everything on terrain, timing, and the willingness to ride directly at the enemy king while men died around him. This wasn't genius. This was controlled desperation executed with absolute conviction, and it worked because Parmenion held when holding was impossible, because the Phalanx reformed under fire when any sane formation would have broken, because the companions followed Alexander into odds that should have killed them all. Issus was won. The Persian army was shattered, and in Babylon, when Darius heard the news, he'd start raising another army, because empires don't surrender after one battle, no matter how decisive. But something had changed. The equation that held the Persian Empire together, the king shows up, the king wins, was broken. And once that equation broke, every satrap, every subject nation, every Greek mercenary would start asking the same question. Why are we fighting for a king who runs? The answer would come at Gaugamela 2 years later. But that was then. For now, November 333 BCE, the battlefield at Issus was silent, except for the dying, and Alexander slept the sleep of men who'd bet everything and won, knowing they'd have to do it again. The morning after Issus, Macedonian burial details walked the battlefield counting bodies. They separated friend from enemy, equipment from corpses, the living from the dead. This took days. 40 to 50,000 Persian dead, maybe more, scattered across 5 square kilometers. The smell arrived on the second day, when the bodies started decomposing under the Mediterranean sun. Sweet, rotten, unmistakable. Soldiers wrapped cloth around their faces and kept working. You couldn't leave that many corpses unburied. Disease would kill more men than the battle did. The Macedonian count came in gradually as units reported their losses. 800 dead, official number, which meant probably 1,000 once you added the men who die from wounds over the next week. Another 1,500 wounded, seriously enough to be combat ineffective. Out of an army of 40,000, those were acceptable losses for a victory this decisive. Acceptable if you weren't one of the dead, if you weren't one of the men lying in a captured Persian tent with a punctured lung or a shattered leg, waiting to see if infection would kill you before the physicians could save you. Nicanor, Parmenion's son, died on the 3rd day after the battle. The arrow wound in his thigh had looked survivable, clean entry and exit, but infection set in fast. Fever, delirium, then death. He was 32. He'd commanded the Hypaspists, held the hinge between cavalry and phalanx, done exactly what Alexander needed him to do. His reward was dying in a tent far from home while his father watched helplessly. Parmenion buried him in Syrian soil with full military honors, then went back to work because the campaign wasn't over and grief was a luxury generals couldn't afford during active operations. The Persian wounded were a different problem. Macedonian physicians couldn't treat tens of thousands of casualties. They didn't have supplies, didn't have translators, didn't have time. Most Persian wounded were left where they fell. Some died. Some were killed by scavengers. Some crawled to nearby villages and either survived or didn't, depending on whether locals were willing to help. Ancient warfare's dirty secret was that casualty counts only measured men killed in action. The real death toll was double or triple that number, wounded men dying slowly from infections, dehydration, exposure, because the medical capacity to save them didn't exist. But Alexander needed the Persian royal family alive. On the second day after the battle, once the physicians had finished with his shoulder wound and declared him fit to move, he went to the royal tent where Darius's family was being held. His mother, Sisygambis, in her 60s, who'd seen her son become king 4 years ago, and now watched him run from battle. His wife, Statera, young, beautiful by contemporary accounts, who'd traveled to war with her husband because Persian royal families stayed together. His daughters, teenagers, old enough to understand they were hostages. His son, 6 years old, who probably didn't understand anything except that strangers had replaced his father. Alexander entered with Hephaestion and a translator. He was still bandaged, moving stiffly from the shoulder wound, but he'd put on clean armor and his royal diadem because appearances mattered. Sisygambis, who'd prostrated herself before Hephaestion the previous night, started to apologize again. Alexander stopped her. "You'll be treated as royalty," he said through the translator. "Your quarters, your food, your servants, nothing changes except who's providing them. Your son fled. I'm not punishing you for his decisions." This was calculated, but Sisygambis apparently believed it, or chose to believe it, or understood that belief was safer than skepticism. Ancient sources say she came to prefer Alexander to her own son, which was probably propaganda, but tells you something about how Alexander wanted the story told. He needed the Persians to see him as a legitimate successor to their empire, not a foreign conqueror. Dead royal families made martyrs and resistance heroes. Living ones, treated with conspicuous respect, made political capital. Statera, Darius's wife, asked through the translator if her husband was alive. Alexander said yes. She asked if she'd see him again. Alexander didn't answer that question. He couldn't promise it without lying or revealing strategic plans. So he changed the subject, asked about her children, made polite conversation, and left. The message was clear. You're hostages, but comfortable hostages, and your treatment depends on good behavior and political usefulness. The captured Persian camp was wealth beyond anything the Macedonians had experienced. Gold worked into furniture, utensils, tent decorations, silk in quantities that made it a common material instead of an exotic luxury. Food supplies for months, preserved meats, dried fruits, grains, wine from across the empire. Darius had brought his imperial household to war, thousands of servants and craftsmen and administrators, because Persian kings traveled with the infrastructure of government. The camp was a mobile palace, and now it belonged to Alexander. The treasure alone, gold, silver, precious stones, worked metal, was estimated at several thousand talents. Ancient sources give conflicting numbers, but even conservative estimates put it at enough wealth to fund the Macedonian army for years. This was the immediate practical result of Issus. Alexander's financial problem, the one where he'd invaded Asia with 6 months of operating capital, was solved. He could pay his soldiers, hire more troops, bribe cities into surrender, and keep the campaign running indefinitely. But the strategic result was more important. Issus opened the entire Levantine coast. Within 6 months, every coastal city from the Gulf of Issus to Egypt would either surrender or fall to siege. The Persian fleet, 300 ships based in Phoenician and Cypriot ports, would lose its bases and become strategically irrelevant. The Mediterranean, which Persia had controlled through naval superiority, would become a Macedonian lake. That meant Alexander could secure his supply lines, communicate with Macedonia safely, receive reinforcements, and eliminate the threat of Persian forces landing behind him in Greece. Darius, meanwhile, fled northeast through the Amanus Mountains with maybe 1,000 cavalry, all that remained of his army's command structure. He reached Thapsacus on the Euphrates, crossed into Mesopotamia, and made it to Babylon by December. There, he started receiving reports. How many survived? Maybe 40,000, scattered across Asia Minor and Syria, some regrouping, most deserting. What happened to his family? Captured, but alive and reportedly well treated. What happened to the treasury? Captured. What happened to his reputation? Destroyed. This was the real cost of Issus for Persia, not the battlefield casualties, which the empire could replace, not the lost treasure, which the empire could afford. The cost was credibility. For 200 years, the Persian imperial system had functioned on a simple equation. The king shows up, the king wins, the empire stays unified. That equation broke at Issus. Every satrap from Egypt to Bactria was now doing political math, calculating whether their future involved staying loyal to a king who fled or negotiating with the Macedonian who kept winning. Some stayed loyal. Some switched sides immediately. Most waited to see what happened next. This was rational calculation, not cowardice. Satraps governed territories the size of major kingdoms. They commanded their own armies, collected their own taxes, maintained their own power bases. Their loyalty to the Persian crown was transactional, not ideological. As long as the crown provided security and legitimacy, they paid tribute and sent troops. But a crown that couldn't provide security or demonstrate military superiority, that was a bad investment. Darius understood this. He sent peace offers to Alexander in the months after Issus. The terms were generous by any normal standard. All territory west of the Euphrates, effectively half the Persian Empire. A massive tribute payment, 30,000 talents. Marriage alliance with a Persian princess. Recognition as legitimate ruler of the territories he'd conquered. These were terms that would have ended most wars, terms that gave Alexander everything his father Philip had dreamed of conquering. Alexander rejected them. According to sources, he read the letter, laughed, and dictated a response. The essence was, "I already own everything you're offering to give me. If you want to keep the rest, come and take it back." This was more than arrogance. This was Alexander understanding that he'd shifted from Philip's war to his own war, from a campaign of conquest to a campaign of replacement. He wasn't fighting to hurt Persia. He was fighting to become Persia. This transformation started at Issus in that captured Persian tent, sleeping on silk bedding, being served by Persian slaves, looking at Persian wealth, and understanding what being a Persian king meant. Alexander began adopting Persian customs slowly, carefully, in ways his Macedonian officers found disturbing. He started wearing Persian dress for formal occasions. He adopted the Persian court ceremony, where subjects prostrated themselves before the king. He appointed Persians to administrative positions. He married Persian women, not just for alliance, but as a statement about cultural fusion. His Macedonian veterans hated this. They'd fought to defeat Persia, not to become Persian. But Alexander wasn't interested in their approval. He'd understood something at Issus that his officers missed. You couldn't rule 50 million people through military occupation. You needed legitimacy, administration, cultural continuity. The Persian system worked. It had worked for 200 years. Alexander's innovation wasn't destroying that system. It was putting himself at the top of it. The next 2 years were consolidation. Tyre resisted, got besieged for 7 months, finally fell, was made an example. Egypt surrendered without a fight and declared Alexander pharaoh because they hated Persian rule and would accept anyone who wasn't Persian. Alexander marched through Palestine, Syria, Phoenicia, taking cities, building supply bases, securing his strategic position. Darius spent the same 2 years raising another army, bigger than the one he'd lost, determined to finish this war. They met again at Gaugamela in October 331 BCE. Darius chose open plains this time, learned his lesson about terrain, brought 100,000 men, maybe more. Alexander brought 50,000, and the same tactical system that worked at Issus. The result was predictable. Alexander feinted, created a gap, charged through it, drove for Darius personally. Darius fled again. The Persian center collapsed again. Casualty counts were even worse. Estimates run up to 90,000 Persian dead. After Gaugamela, Darius fled east with the remnants of his army. Alexander pursued him across Iran, through the summer of 330 BCE, getting closer. But Darius's own satraps got there first. Bessus, satrap of Bactria, and others in the high command decided that Darius was a liability. The empire needed a king who could win. Darius couldn't, so they killed him, stabbed him in his own camp, left him dying by the roadside, and rode east to continue the resistance under new leadership. Alexander found Darius's body. The Persian king was in his late 40s, killed by his own men, left unceremoniously in the dirt like any other casualty. Alexander reportedly covered the body with his own cloak, gave orders for a royal funeral, sent the remains to Persepolis for burial with honors. This was propaganda again, the gesture that showed Alexander was a legitimate Persian king avenging Darius's murder. Not a foreign invader celebrating his enemy's death. It worked. Many Persians accepted Alexander as Darius's successor rather than continuing resistance under Bessus. The war continued until 327 BCE. Alexander conquered Bactria, Sogdiana, crossed the Hindu Kush, invaded India, fought the Battle of Hydaspes against King Porus, won again, and finally stopped when his army mutinied and refused to march further east. He'd conquered everything from Greece to the Indus River, ruled an empire larger than the Persian Empire had ever been, and accomplished it in 11 years between ages 22 and 33. Then he died, June 323 BCE, Babylon, age 32. Cause disputed. Ancient sources say fever, possibly malaria, possibly typhoid, possibly poisoning, possibly complications from his old wounds combined with alcoholism and exhaustion. Modern analysis suggests any or all of those. The man who'd survived Issus, Gaugamela, Hydaspes, dozens of smaller battles, multiple serious wounds, died in bed from something his physicians couldn't identify or treat. His last words, when asked who should inherit the empire, were reportedly the strongest, which was either profound or catastrophic, depending on your perspective. The empire lasted about 10 minutes after his death. His generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Cassander, Lysimachus, carved it into pieces and spent the next 40 years fighting each other for control. The wars of the Diadochi, the successor wars, killed hundreds of thousands and eventually produced 3 major kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia. None of them lasted in their original form. Rome absorbed them gradually between 230 BCE. The political unity Alexander created died with him, but the cultural unity survived for 300 years. This was the Hellenistic period, when Greek language, art, philosophy, science, and culture fused with Near Eastern and Egyptian and Persian traditions to create something new. Cities founded by Alexander, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, countless others named Alexandria across the former Persian Empire became centers of learning, trade, and cultural exchange. Greek became the lingua franca from Italy to India. The Library of Alexandria, the lighthouse, the museum, the scientific advances, the philosophical schools, the art and architecture, that was Alexander's real legacy. Not the empire that fragmented, but the culture that spread. Think about what that means. Alexander fought at Issus to conquer Persia. He succeeded. The conquest lasted 10 years, but the battle started a process of cultural fusion that shaped the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world for centuries. Christianity developed in a Hellenistic context. Early Christian texts were written in Greek. The Romans, who eventually conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, adopted Greek culture so completely that educated Romans spoke Greek as a second language and studied Greek philosophy and literature. The Islamic Golden Age, 700 years later, was built partly on Hellenistic scientific and philosophical texts that had been preserved in Alexandria and later Baghdad. That's the irony. The empire Alexander died trying to hold together collapsed immediately. But the cultural change, the thing he started almost accidentally by merging Macedonian and Persian and Egyptian systems, outlasted Rome, influenced Islam, and echoes into the present through the entire Western intellectual tradition. He thought he was conquering territory. He was actually spreading a culture. The territory was temporary. The culture was permanent. But none of that was visible at Issus. At Issus, November 333 BCE, all you could see was bodies, blood, exhausted soldiers, a captured royal family, and 2 kings, one wounded but victorious, one alive but running. The men who fought that battle, the ones who died in the river or got trampled by cavalry or bled out from wounds over the following week, they died for reasons that seemed clear at the time. They died for their king, for their city, for conquest, for defense, for pay, for honor, for fear of what happened if they ran. Immediate tactical reasons that made sense in the moment. The strategic reasons, opening the Levantine coast, securing Mediterranean control, breaking Persian credibility. Those became clear over the following months. The historical reasons, cultural fusion, Hellenistic civilization, the framework for Christianity and later Islamic scholarship, those took centuries to develop. The universal truth? That took millennia, and we're still figuring it out. Here's what Issus actually proved. You can win a battle through systematic violence, terrain advantage, and willingness to gamble everything on killing the enemy commander. You can break an empire by breaking the equation that holds it together. You can conquer territory through military superiority and political legitimacy. But you can't control what happens after you're dead. You can't dictate legacy. You can't prevent your life's work from fragmenting the moment you stop enforcing unity through personal presence and threat of violence. Alexander created an empire that required Alexander to function. Without him, it collapsed. That's not a failure of his generals or his system. That's the fundamental limit of personality-based power. Empires built on infrastructure and institutions can survive the death of their founders. Empires built on the founder's personal military genius and charisma cannot. The Persian Empire survived multiple kings because it was a system. Alexander's empire was Alexander. Remove Alexander, and the empire had no foundation. The men whose hands got cut off at Issus, the ones Alexander found when he marched north, they never saw the empire's rise or fall. Most died from infection or suicide in the days after their mutilation. A few survived, returned to Macedonia eventually, lived as cripples on state pensions Alexander established for wounded veterans. They told their story, how Persians came to the town where they'd been left recovering, how they tried to resist or hide, how Persian soldiers held them down and worked methodically with sharp knives and hot iron, how they were left alive specifically to send a message. That message, that the Persian Empire would erase you if you invaded it, was the message Darius intended. The message Alexander received was different. There's no negotiating with this enemy, no surrendering, no retreating. The only options are winning completely or dying in the attempt. Darius's brutality eliminated the middle ground, forced the battle to be total, and thereby guaranteed that when he lost everything. The battlefield at Issus is gone now. The Pinarus River has changed course multiple times over 2 millennia. Archaeologists debate the exact location. Was it here, at this river valley, or there, at that one? The terrain has changed. Cities have risen and fallen. The bones of 150,000 men who stood in that valley one November day have dissolved into soil that grows crops nobody connects to ancient warfare. But you can still see the pattern. In every war where personality replaces system, where charisma replaces structure, where individual genius becomes the empire's foundation. Watch what happens when that individual dies or fails or runs. Watch how fast decades of construction collapse. Watch how legacy gets rewritten, how victory becomes ambiguous, how the things people died for turn out to be temporary, while the accidental consequences become permanent. Alexander didn't create Hellenistic civilization on purpose. He created it by breaking the Persian Empire and then being unable to replace it with anything more durable than himself. He won Issus through tactical brilliance and strategic gambling. He lost history through human mortality and the impossibility of institutionalizing genius. The battle was decisive. The legacy was accidental. The irony is that what he built lasted 10 years, while what he destroyed, cultural separation between Greek and Persian worlds, stayed destroyed for centuries. The men who died at Issus died for kingdoms that don't exist anymore, for kings whose names mean nothing to most people, for causes that were forgotten within generations. But they changed the world anyway, not through their intentions, but through their actions' unintended consequences. That's what history actually is. Not great men doing great things for great reasons, but men making immediate decisions under pressure, winning or losing for tactical reasons, and inadvertently creating strategic changes they never planned and couldn't control. Issus mattered because it broke an empire that thought itself unbreakable, because it proved that numbers mean nothing if terrain and system negate them, because it showed that kings who run lose more than battles. They lose the fear that keeps empires together, and because it started a cultural fusion that nobody planned but everyone inherited. The bodies are gone. The empires are gone. The kings are gone. The river has moved. The battlefield is forgotten. But the consequences, the way Greek and Persian and Egyptian culture merged, the framework that shaped Christianity and Islam, the intellectual tradition that connects Aristotle to modern philosophy, that's still here, still functional, still shaping how we think. That's the universal truth history keeps demonstrating, and humans keep forgetting. The things you think you're fighting for are temporary. The things you're actually creating are accidental. And the outcomes that matter most won't be visible for centuries after you're dead. You can win every battle and lose the war. You can lose every battle and win the legacy. Or you can do what Alexander did, win the battles, lose the empire, and accidentally win something else entirely. Issus was decisive. Alexander won. Darius fled. The Persian Empire broke, and everything that mattered happened afterward for reasons nobody fighting in that river valley could have predicted or understood. That's not inspiring. That's just honest. And maybe honesty about what violence actually accomplishes versus what we tell ourselves it accomplishes is the only thing worth remembering about battles nobody can locate on a map anymore. If you made it this far through 2 hours of systematic violence and ambiguous legacy, you understand something most people miss about military history. It's not about the tactics. It's about what happens when the tactics succeed and you realize victory was just the beginning of a longer, more complicated story. What battle do you want covered next? What historical moment do you think you understand but probably don't? Comment below. And if this resonated, subscribe. Because there are 1,000 more stories like this, waiting to kill your comfortable certainties about how history actually works.